Hello out there, we're on the air, it's hockey night tonight.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Light and Lamp podcast. I am here with Tim.
Yo, yo, yo.
And only Tim for today. And we're going to be doing some redrafts. So we decided to take a look at some historical drafts that probably had some first rounds that shouldn't have been where they should have been, or that weren't where they should have been. I believe, Tim, you did the 2000 draft?
Yes, the 2000 NHL Entry Draft.
Okay, and I did the 2012 entry draft. So I had the Nail Yakupov draft. Tim had the Rick DiPietro draft.
Shit, Pietro.
And we're just going to go into it. We're just going to kind of explain how we think that the draft should have shaken out. I think obviously have some back and forth about that. So why don't you start by kind of explaining your thought process, like how you went into it, why you picked the certain players, because I'll explain mine after, so we kind of have a reference for why players end up where they should be. But I'm very curious to see, how did you go about processing this redraft?
So, for my redraft, I tried to just replace players with better players of that position that should have went higher. So, minus Rick DiPietro, who just got... Well, actually, he did get replaced. He got replaced by, Henrik Lundqvist, a better goalie. But it's still a goalie pick. I didn't pick, Danny Heatley first for the Islanders. And I pretty much just tried to... There were a lot of defensemen in this draft, and a lot of them weren't necessarily the first defenseman either. A lot of them were just 20-minute guys who just went on, played D. So I tried to pick the best ones that I thought. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, so let's go through we'll go through the actual draft results first, and we'll kind of talk about whether or not we think they should stay in the first round, and then we'll look at your redraft and see who you picked. All right. So I'm noticing a lot of these names are obviously not going to stay in the first round. So the real NHL Entry Draft 2000, the first overall pick, obviously Rick DiPietro, ended up playing 318 games for the New York Islanders. I have mixed feelings about whether or not he would stay in the first round. I think for certain teams, yes, because...
Well, that's the issue. Boston needed a goalie at this time.
Yeah, I think for certain teams he would stay in the first round only because, a lot of people forget he was an NHL All-Star. He was having really good seasons for the Islanders before he got hurt. So I feel like certain teams that maybe they were more competitive at this time but needed that, All-Star level goaltending, they might be okay with just taking on Rick DiPietro for 3 or 4 years of All-Star goaltending and then moving on. So I feel like you can make the argument that he stays in the first round. But I'm also not going to fight too hard for that. How do you feel about that?
I kind of agree with you. It was honestly a really hard pick to not place him in the top 30 because, like you said, he was playing well. So it's really do you think that maybe redrafted him somewhere? Does he still get hurt, I guess, is really the question. If he still gets hurt, then I'd probably, like I said, I'd take him on, like you said, rather. I would take him on, maybe a cup contending team. Yeah, just because, as a backup.
Yeah, so maybe a Washington or a Dallas at this time, teams that were still in their competitive heydays. Yeah, St. Louis for sure. Danny Heatley goes number 2 to the Atlanta Thrashers. I don't really know if there's much of an argument against him being a first rounder.
No, he's top 5 pick pretty much no matter what in this draft.
50 and 07, baby. Oh, sorry, I skipped somebody. Marian Gaborik went second to the Atlanta Thrashers. No, sorry.
No, he goes third.
He goes third to the Atlanta Thrashers. I'm looking at the wrong column. I'm going to label this real quick. So, Marian Gaborik goes third to the Minnesota Wild. Again, I don't really know if there's much of an argument you can make for not drafting him in the first round.
Yeah, no, that's probably if it wasn't for Henrik Lundqvist, that's probably your first round. That's your first pick overall.
Right. I mean, the guy was 30 to 40 goal scorer for most of his career when he wasn't hurt. 815 points. Yeah, I don't know if you can really argue against that. Rusty Klesl is an interesting one. Rostislav Klesl goes to the Columbus Blue Jackets, and I think he kind of fits that mold of what you were saying, where he wasn't flashy and he never really did anything major, but he kind of just went out there and played hockey. I don't think he's a first rounder by typical standards, what you would think of a first rounder. Looking at this draft, I think you can maybe squeak him in somewhere, but I feel like he's more of a second, third round role player type kind of guy.
That's exactly just the defensemen in this draft. Like, there weren't really any superstars, maybe unless you want to include like Ron Wall, but even then he wasn't a superstar. He was just a really good defensive defenseman. Big body.
So next, it's fifth
That was
overall
the
pick.
Ray Lewis of ice hockey.
Rafi Torres goes fifth to the New York Islanders. If you could give me the first half of his career, I would say yes. If you can give me his Phoenix part of his career, I'm going to say shoot him into the moon. But taking him as a whole, I mean, he's kind of one of those guys you have to take the good with the bad, but I've always had a really bad taste in my mouth about Rafi Torres. But I guess in the context of this particular draft, he would probably stay in the top 30, I would think.
Yeah, I think part of his problem was the injury that that knee injury he took.
And also his propensity for 25-game suspensions and trying to end Marian Hossa's career.
Essentially, yeah, that's part of the issue.
Scott Hartnell obviously would stay in the first round. Don't really know if there's an argument there. Lars Johnson, I don't know who that is. I have no idea who that even is. So I'm going to say no. Nikita Alexeyev, again, I don't know who that is. So no. Brent Kahn played one game in the NHL. No. I don't know like half of these guys. All right, let's just skip because the next guy on this list that I know is Ron Hainsey. And I think he's a serviceable, solid defenseman. Again, like you said, not really a superstar, but I think he's like a solid defenseman that can play 22 minutes and match up against tough guys. But
look at his stats. He played 1,100 games and had 300 points.
This draft's
he's not like killing it on the stat sheet, but he was playing I think he was averaging around 20 minutes a night on the ice.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I mean, he's just a solid defenseman. I mean, he's not going to get you many points, but he's going to do what you need to do. Vaclav, Marcel Hossa, I know he's a Ranger for a while. I don't think he'd stay in the first round. Brooks Orpik, he's a solid player. I like Brooks Orpik in this draft.
Yeah.
Volchenkov, solid defenseman. Was he a Ranger? He was, right?
Yeah. Wait, you skipped over Frolov, bro. What the fuck?
Oh, right. Alexander Frolov. Yeah. My dude. How did I do that?
He was a New York Ranger.
Chris Kalanos. I remember his name. What do I know his name from? Chris Kalanos. Oh, my God. I think he was involved in some massive fight. If I remember correctly. He was involved in some like huge bench clearing brawl, and that's why his name is ringing a bell.
Volchenko wasn't a Ranger, by the way. Yeah, Frolov was. I don't know if
Volchenkov, Tampa Bay Lightning? What do I know him from?
No. He was a Senator and then a Devil.
Huh. Interesting. My memory's all wrong on that. Brad Boyes. In his heyday, Brad Boyes was a good player.
Yeah, Brad Boyes, he's in my pick. He's in my draft, so I won't talk about it right now.
Steve Ott, Brian Sotheby, Justin Williams, Nick Cromwell going 30th is an absolute steal. And that's the rest of it. All right, so let's go through your redraft here. So you redrafted Henrik Lundqvist to the New York Islanders, number 1 overall.
No brainer.
So I'm going to let you take it from here so you can talk as much or as little as you want about these picks, and I'll interject with questions if I have any.
So Henrik Lundqvist goes first because greatest goaltender of all time. No. we're not gonna make that argument right now. No, it's just obvious. Like if he goes to that Islanders team's probably won a cup by now.
Yeah, that would have been nice to have an
20
actual
years
goaltender.
And they would have at least made it to a cup then, in my opinion. So I put Marian Gaborik from 3rd to 2nd because I think he's better than Danny Heatley. Sorry, Danny. Get on the bench.
See, that's interesting to me because they're very similar players, I feel. But I feel like perhaps Danny Heatley's numbers might be a little inflated because he was so good on the Thrashers, and then after that, he was kind of just okay.
That's pretty much what it comes down to. And I also, Marian Gaborik was also a very clutch player.
Yeah.
For even for that LA Kings team, like, I hate him. I hate him.
I feel like it was crazy because when Artemi Panarin, or when somebody scored their 40th goal or whatever it was, they said it was the first back-to-back 40 goal scores for the Rangers since someone in like the early 2000s. And I found it really weird because I was like, I remember Marian Gaborik being so good, but he was really injury prone was the problem. But I don't think if you I think if you could take Marian Gaborik on your team, you're not gonna say no.
That's it. Like, he really just. There were seasons where he played 10 games, or close to 10 games.
Yeah.
But for the Rangers, he played almost 4 full seasons. And he put up 42 goals, 22, and then 41. And then his last season, Tortorella pretty much benched him, and I hate him for it. Moving on.
Tortorella tried to turn him into a shot blocker for some reason.
Yeah, I don't. Next up, we have Danny Heatley, who 50-07, not even a question. It was really just a matter of whether he was going with 2nd or 3rd, and I think he's 3rd pick, not a 2nd, personally.
I
don't think he faced any real difficult situations in his career like that.
Besides when he had that motorcycle accident.
Yeah, pretty much.
Rest in peace, Dan Snyder.
I've got Scott Hartnell at 4th from 6th. And I think that... So, the Blue Jackets drafted a defenseman, and I honestly think Scott Hartnell is a defenseman who's played forward. Like, it's really all he's doing. Like, he's playing forward, and he's a defenseman. And he's just a good hockey player. Like, I don't really know what to say. Like, the guy played 1,249 games. It's 707 points. 1,800 PIM.
Yeah, well, that's one I was actually going to ask you about. So, so I'm assuming the thought process was Scott Hartnell is a better player enough than Nicholas Kronwall to say Columbus would probably take him over the defenseman that they drafted. Like, they're drafting out of position because he's a better player.
Yeah, essentially. And that's not saying Nicholas Kronwall's not a phenomenal defenseman, because he is. But Scott Hartnell's presence on the ice alone makes a huge difference. Because the guy can score, he can spit in your face, and then cry at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't put up ridiculous scoring numbers by any means, but if you look back at the Flyers over these past 20 years, he was kind of, or if you look at the success of the Flyers team rather later in his career, he was kind of clutch.
Well, he was always the cog on that line with Giroux and Voracek, where you always need that kind of like get into corners, dig the puck out, power forward type guy when you're playing with skill guys like Giroux and Voracek. So I'd be very interested because the Blue Jackets of this era tended to be, I mean, granted they were just getting into the NHL at this point, but they were very like blue collar, like not a lot of flash until they picked up some guys like Rick Nash. But I'd be interested to see if like they might have gone for more skill had they had somebody like Scott Hartnell to kind of build around. You know.
That's it. I think he's someone who's gonna play his heart out the whole game. Something that really bothers me about a guy like Chris Kreider, who I think is a similar type player, is Chris Kreider. Not anymore, but he used to just give up on the puck. He'd give up on the play, and I think that's one of the worst traits that you can have. So moving on, I have Cronwall at 5th, going to the Islanders.
I wish
over Raffi Torres, who was the original pick.
I have absolutely no argument with that.
I think if you put Henrik Lundqvist in net and you put Nicholas Cronwall as a defenseman, one, Henrik's not going to get touched, which is the important part. And two, Cronwall really was just a great defenseman. He just got outshined by like some of the greatest players in NHL history. I don't even know what to argue.
Yeah, it's hard to really shine when you're on a roster with Nick Lidstrom, Pavel Datsyuk, and Henrik Zetterberg.
To name a few.
Yeah, to name a few of those Detroit Red Wing All-Star teams. But I agree. I think looking at the other defensemen that you have in a draft, I think he's clearly head and shoulders above the other defensemen that went in this draft.
That's exactly, like, they're not even close.
Right, yeah.
The next best defenseman's probably, like, Paul Martin or something.
Or Brooks Orpik. But even then, like,
Yeah.
I don't even think they're in the same, like, class. I think Nicholas Cronwall is honestly...
He's easily one of the greatest open ice hitters of ever.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, the guy's literally just a wall.
It's a freight train.
He really is. But I think that's enough about Cronwall. At 6th, I have Justin Williams, and I think that just goes without even being said. Justin Williams was a great hockey player and a good leader.
He's still playing.
Or is, yeah.
Mr. Game 7.
I say was because we're talking about their past career.
Right, yeah.
For future reference. So Justin Williams is good. Like, just a good hockey player. Like, I don't even know what to say. He's a great leader. Yeah. At 7th, I have Ilya Bryzgalov going to the Boston Bruins.
You sound almost disappointed to be saying
And
that.
no, the reason is because I think Briz is the second best goalie in this draft, ignoring what we said about DiPietro earlier. Or taking into account what we said about him earlier, rather. And the Boston Bruins, their goalie at the time, I don't remember his name, but he went, I think it was 13 and 16.
Let's see, I'm curious now. 2000 Boston Bruins. So, I will say, given, because Bryzgalov's career was like a career of really high highs and really low lows, especially after he left Phoenix.
Yeah.
So, would you, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but do you think that you might have an argument for, say, taking the shortened but really high peak over DiPietro versus the kind of really high highs but really low lows but longer term career of Ilya Bryzgalov?
I would go with Briz is more worth it purely because of that longevity.
Let's see.
I'm not a very short term guy when it comes to building a team.
The three goalies for the Bruins in 1999-2000 season was Brian Defoe, John Graham, and Rob Tallis.
Yeah, and Defoe went 13 and 16, I think it was, right?
Brian Defoe went 13 and 16, John Graham went 7 and 10, and Rob Tallis went 4 and 13.
Yeah, and if you look at their goals for and goals against numbers, they're not even that bad. They just didn't have a goalie. I think if they put a better net minder in that, then they could win the game. They could win some games, rather.
Yeah, Big Jumbo Joe was still a Boston Bruin.
But Boston also has another pick in this draft that we'll talk about when we get to it.
Okay.
So, next up I have Antoine Vermette going to the Tampa Bay Lightning. And, I mean, guy's just like a great center.
Yeah, I mean, if I remember correctly, he had really good face-off numbers through the year, which is interesting because you think about like great uh, Tampa Bay Lightning centers. Obviously, the first guy that comes to mind is Vincent LeCavalier. I think Vermette would be perfect to play kind of second or third line behind a guy like LeCavalier. So I actually really like that pick. I think he's a perfect utility center for them.
Next up is Brooks Orpik to the Calgary Flames. Calgary originally drafted a goalie. I think that they could have gotten away with the goalies that they had, and if they had a better team surrounding them, including this defenseman. I also think that the goalies weren't that great, and if they wanted to, they could have drafted one later. If they just wanted a bender to stick in net.
Did Brooks Orpik's more defensive game as opposed to an offensive player like Vishnowsky influence that pick, or you just think Orpik's just a better player?
I think Orpik's just a great player. Like, I put Orpik. I also think that he's probably just a much better player than Vishnowsky.
That's fair. I mean, Lubo is always also kind of flying under the radar on a lot of those Anaheim teams, so I don't really have much of an argument against that.
Chicago had the next two picks, the 10th and the 11th. And I put Rafi Torres as the 10th and Lubomir Visnovsky as the 11th.
I need to hear your argument for Torres because that's very interesting to me.
So, he's really just one of the better forwards left in this. Who's not a center, rather. Also, I originally had Rafi Torres higher in the draft, but I thought about his psychotic break, and I said, maybe he just should. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe the guy is not worth that pick. So the thing is, like, he averaged like 19, 18 something goals a season, which isn't great numbers, but that's a solid third liner. It's a solid second liner. I don't really know how you can really argue with that much.
Yeah, I think really, the biggest thing is obviously his discipline issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the primary thing now is holding him back, because without it, to me, he was very much like a Brian Bickle type player, where he walks the line, right? But Bickle would put up like 30 to 35 points a year, and you'd be totally fine with that. And like you said, especially in his early years, Torres was putting up solid third line power forward type minutes. It was just he just lost his mind and started trying to kill people. But for a team like we know with Chicago, who was only 10 years removed from winning their first Stanley Cup or not their first one, but their first one in quite a while in 2010. Torres probably would have been like 28, 29 at the time, and if he had his psychotic issues in check, he'd probably be a very effective part of that team. So, yeah, I can understand why he would still go top 10. And I like the Lubomir Visnovsky pick. I've always had a lot of respect for him, especially he wouldn't even have to be on the top line. Eventually, in this universe, say everything still played out the same way, he would be able to mentor guys like Duncan Keith and Nick Leddy, Brent Seabrook, and stuff like that. So I think that's a really good pick for Chicago. I might put Torres down a little bit just because of that psychotic rage problem, but it's hard to also, like you said, the 20 goals a year as a third liner, like, you can't really ask for much more than that.
This next pick is who I would have probably switched him with if I did, and it's Dominic Moore. I think that his penalty killing abilities are impeccable. I think he's a great utility player, and he puts up goals when you need them. He's not he can go down the ice on the breakout from the penalty kill onto 5-on-5 and score.
Yeah, and I think he really kind of fit the mold of what Anaheim really was, especially what the Anaheim team ended up becoming later on in the 2010s, which was a team of just hardworking guys. Like, they didn't really have any elite snipers, but they had Ryan Getzlaf, Corey Perry,
Exactly, not a team of individuals.
Bobby Ryan at the time, and a guy like Dominic Moore, that kind of like Swiss Army knife utility type player that you can move up and down the lineup. He can play second line, fourth line, third line, whatever you need him to be. I think he fits the mold of what the Anaheim team developed into eventually. So I think he probably, if he stayed on the team, would have been a great piece to have just all around for that Anaheim team.
All right, so where are we? After Dominic Moore is Paul Martin to Montreal. They originally took Ron Hainsey. So, for what that's worth. So, I think they're both two great defensemen. If you wanted to say that Ron should have went over Paul, get it to an extent. But Paul really did average around 20 minutes a night on his career. And he had at least 20 goals a season as a defenseman.
Yeah.
Before offensive defensemen were cool.
Because I remember him playing with those Pittsburgh teams, and he was always such a pain in the neck because he always found a way to get that shot from the point through. I remember that was one thing he was really good at. I feel like him and Hainsey are almost exactly the same. Hainsey a little bit more defensively minded, Paul Martin with a little bit more of an offensive flair. But I feel like they're pretty similar defensemen. I think I agree, though. If given the choice, I would take Paul Martin instead of Ron Hainsey. So I agree with your placement there.
All right. Next up is Brad Boyes to Buffalo. And thought process really was Buffalo drafted a Artem Krukov. So I probably butchered that. Sorry, Russians. Or whatever the fuck he is. I mean, he put up 65 points 3 times. So I don't really know how you could argue that he's bad. I think that he's could be a decent second, third liner for them. That's kind of the issue going down the rest of this draft. You don't really have many named players throughout the rest of the way. It's kind of just like he was one of the only guys left in the draft who even played more than 100 games.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot of role players left. But, I mean, the thing for Brad Boyes is even in real life, he had some pretty good years for Buffalo. He was
Did I skip over Steve Ott?
Oh, yeah, you did. Huh.
My bad. 14th Steve Ott to Colorado, and it's because Steve Ott's just a good fucking player. I don't even know. I don't need to explain it to you.
Yeah, I think he's perfect to go to Colorado, especially given a team like Colorado who is an offensive-minded team. Having that rough and tumble kind of big body player makes a lot of sense. But yeah, Brad Boyes had some good years for the Buffalo Sabres, and he had an okay couple seasons for the Islanders. He's kind of, I think, like the perfect third line type guy. And for a team like Buffalo, who, again, at this point was a competitive team, can't really argue with taking a role player in the third line. You could always use more depth scoring, right?
I'm sorry. I was reading the text. My apologies. Sorry.
We were either you were going to say something about Steve Ott, or we were going to move on to the next pick.
Oh, okay. That I just heard the pause. All right. So we did Brad Boyes. 16th, I have John Michael Liles. And talk about him. He finished second in points. Or he was at one point second in points for this draft class as a defenseman. So, I not that makes him the best choice, but his numbers are good. I don't really know him all too well.
I remember he was a big acquisition for the Maple Leafs at one point. Um, yeah, I mean, I might actually end up putting him a little bit lower because his longevity wasn't as long as some of the other guys like Hainsey or Derek Engelland. Um,
Well, that's kind of the issue, right? He really didn't play that many games.
yeah, I feel like going to Toronto kind of killed his career, which it does for a lot of players. But I mean, he was good for when he played. It just he didn't last quite as long. But again, it's that case of are you gonna accept kind of the
I mean,
brighter, shorter career?
He played like 800 something games.
Yeah, that's true. I just think it's weird because like Hainsey and Engelland are still playing, but again, I mean, yeah, 800 games. I mean, if you can get an 800 game defenseman out of a draft, I mean, you'll take that any day of the week, right?
But he played until 2017, so he played for like 17 years or whatever it was.
He was still playing in 2017.
Yeah,
Wait, wasn't he? He was a Hurricane at that point, right?
he was a Bruin.
What? That's crazy. All right, so maybe his career lasted longer than I thought. All right, yeah, so I can understand that then. For some reason, I didn't think he lasted that long, huh?
He didn't put up many points. Not that penalties are necessarily the equivalent of it, but I like a good, strong defense at the back end who's willing to, take a few penalties. And I think that him only having less than 300 penalty minutes says something.
Yeah, it's hard to kill penalties when you're sitting in the box, right? So.
Yeah. All right. So next up, I have Alex Frolov going to the Edmonton Oilers over Alexei Mikhanov, whatever the hell that name is.
Microwave.
But yeah, honestly, Alex Microwave.
There's a lot of Russians in this draft, or at least names of the Slavic variety. Interesting.
And as we were talking about earlier, Frolov was just like he had a shorter career, but his numbers were good. He put up almost 400 points in 500 something games.
Yeah, I mean, he put up 175 goals, so in 579 games. Kind of unfortunate that he ended up going back. I think he left to go back to Russia at one point, but who is drafting him? The LA Kings? LA wasn't so good at this time, but, again...
No, the Oilers.
Or the Oilers. Frolov. Yes, the Oilers. So, yeah, actually, the Oilers, I mean, at this point, they were starting to build what ended up becoming the future of this team. And he's the perfect mold of what ended up becoming the Edmonton Oilers, right? This high-flying, scoring-driven hockey team, even back then when they were, towards the end of this decade when they were starting to take guys, whatchamacallit, they were starting to take on players like, yes, I know, thank you, like Taylor Hall or even Ryan Nugent-Hopkins or Jordan Eberle, so... I think he ends up fitting the mold of what became the Edmonton Oilers. So I like that pick. That's a solid pick. I think I would take that draft as well.
All right, so now I have Hainsey going to Pittsburgh, and this comes with the fact that they didn't get Paulie.
And then you get Paulie, and then in the original draft they took Brooks Orpik, which again all three defensemen pretty similar type games. Ron Hainsey's not a bad consolation prize. I really think either him or Engelland are, at this point in the draft are kind of interchangeable. So,
Essentially.
Yeah. No issue there.
19th was Jarrett Stoll to Phoenix. Chris Kalanos originally went there.
Jarrett Stoll, solid two-way player. I think, Phoenix of this era could have used some scoring, but there really isn't a lot of scoring left in the draft at this point, so Jarrett Stoll is a great two-way player. Probably one of the more underrated two-way players for those LA Kings teams. So solid draft pick, I think, especially this late in the draft, given who's left. I think Jarrett Stoll down at 19 is a
Solid pick.
great pick. Yeah.
Next up, we have Mike Rupp going to the LA Kings instead of Frolov. And I just think Mike Rupp fits that LA Kings style hockey.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird, right? Because for a while in the LA Kings early years, they were, the Triple Crown line, right? Like this high scoring, high flying offensive team, and then they started to slow down, and then even in the early 2000s, we saw them develop this very West Coast, super heavy, tough checking game up and down the lineup. And I totally agree. I think Mike Rupp fits that mold. I think he fits the mold of what the team was at the time and fits the mold of what they were going to become. So I think his longevity on this team probably would have gotten more mileage out of his career. So I think he's basically like a prototypical LA King. So makes sense for him to go there just right off the bat instead of... No, actually, I don't think he ever was an LA King, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. All right, so next up we have... Where is it? Englund going to the Ottawa Senators. And Englund, as you said, he's not necessarily the greatest pick that there is, but there aren't really too many good, solid defensemen left in this. And Englund sure as hell has longevity in the fact that he's still playing. So,
yeah, kind of cheating a little bit. Englund over Anton Volchenkov. That one's interesting to me because I remember Volchenkov being just like a lockdown type defense, which obviously Derek Englund is as well. Was it the longevity that ended up putting Derek Englund over Anton Volchenkov and Greg Zanin? Kind of cheating up a little bit again. Was it kind of the longevity of Derek Englund's career that drew you in instead of a guy like Anton Volchenkov?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, Volchenkov, he kind of left. I guess, I don't know if he just couldn't compete anymore or what happened, but he also, not that it matters very much, but he was never really a points guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Obviously, Derek Englund, again, being more of a lockdown type defenseman, but yeah, I think Derek Englund's just reliable. I think that's the word a lot of people would use to describe him, is just being a reliable type defenseman. And to be fair, I mean, even to this day, the Senators don't really have much of a reliable lockdown type defenseman. So especially in those early 2000s, they could have used him. Granted, at some point when they were going to lose Zdeno Chara, obviously Englund's not Zdeno Chara, but it would have been nice to have a guy like Derek Englund to kind of replace those minutes. So
also, I would like to point out that at this part of the draft, I was very stickler about keeping players at their positions for whether who drafted them.
Right.
Which is why you'd see someone like Volchenkov going lower than other people. Like, Volchenkov should probably go above Kopecky, Lombardi, and a few other guys. Zanin.
Roman
Shekmanik. But yeah, so next up is Greg Zanin to the New Jersey Devils. And I honestly know nothing about this man. It's gonna be... So I just did some research, and that's where I put him.
Yeah, I mean, he was basically, if I remember correctly, he's just like a really big, hitter, a big checker. And, the Devils obviously, at some point, we're going to have to replace Scott Stevens. Now, I'm not saying that Greg Zanin is Scott Stevens, but he at least brings that physical element to the game. Obviously, does not have nearly the offensive touch that Scott Stevens had, but I mean, he's not a bad consolation prize, I think, especially at this point in the draft, and to at least keep people on their toes the way that Scott Stevens would. Even though Scott Stevens would just elbow people in the face, but that's a whole other argument for another episode. We have to do an episode of like the most overrated players of all time, but I'm not going to get into that now because I'll be here for years.
Next up, I have Matthew Hendricks going to Vancouver. Not exactly the greatest center in the world, but he playing a while for what it's worth. He had a few what I would believe to be considered successful seasons. Or not really, he had a couple. He's a fourth liner is what it comes down to. He's just one of the few players to still make it in the draft.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that either, especially for those Canucks teams. Like, they tended to lack a little bit of depth being so top heavy with like the Sedins, Burrows, Kessler. You know, obviously this is talking like much later on in their competitive years, but I think they could have used a fourth line center like a guy like, you know, Matt Hendricks for that penalty kill, which was one of the things that plagued those competitive Vancouver Canucks teams. So, role player for the 23rd pick who's going to give you a long-term career, I think you'll take that.
Yeah. Next is Thomas Kopecky to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And to speak about him, he just he's kind of the same thing as Zanin or Hendricks rather. Like, solid player, didn't put up the best numbers, third, fourth liner, but he's making the team.
Yeah, I think, you know, knowing what I know about those early 2000s Maple Leafs teams from obviously their short-lived, or not short-lived, but like their short-term rivalry with the Islanders and that, you know, the couple of playoffs, or the one playoff series. The Maple Leafs of that era really did like to play rough and tumble. They had like, you know, Ty Domi, just to name one guy that would feed you your lunch for lunch. So to get a guy like Kopecky, who's just kind of reliable, I think, and from what I remember from a couple of his playoff runs, like he could put the puck in the back of the net if you needed him to, like a clutch, you know, late goal in the third line. So knowing those early 2000s Toronto Maple Leafs teams, again, solid third liner for a team that liked to play rough and tumble, I don't have an issue with that pick.
Yeah, so next up, we have Matthew Lombardi, son of the great Lombardi. No, not at all.
They're not related to Dean.
No.
Feels bad.
Once again, Lombardi just a guy who just made it in the NHL. He played over 500 games, had 260 points. Really just can't go wrong. I was at this late in the draft, not having seen much of these guys that I recall. I just went based off stats and numbers and what the experts said. And I concluded that the longevity of these picks, along with their stats, showed that they were worth a pick.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, I don't really know much about Matt Lombardi either.
Yeah, so let's not really daunt on him, honestly. Just because the next draft is kind of long. The next pick is Travis Moen to the Washington Capitals. Once again, he played 700 something games. He only had 136 points, but he had 800 PIM. So fourth line grinder, I guess. That's about it. 27th, we have Roman Cechmanek to Boston Bruins. Once again, just solid pick. Most of these picks just come down to being solid. But as I said earlier, I thought that the Bruins could use a goalie. And I think that Cechmanek falls this deep in the draft, and I think he's worth it. Because he was solid in the NHL when he played.
Yeah, he was an average to above average starter, and I think for some of those Bruins teams, that's really all they were looking for, given who
That's
they
really
had.
it. They just needed to kind of get through it. So that's why I put that goalie there. Next up is Michael I don't
Michael
even know.
Ouellet.
Yeah.
Ah.
And
I have no idea who that is, if I'm being honest with you.
honestly, no fucking clue either. We'll just move past him. Like the experts said that he was great. Like all like the pre-draft things that they had, pre-draft rankings were all great. He had solid numbers. I really just didn't know what to do, so I just put him there. Anton Volchenkov is at 29 to the Detroit Red Wings, and as I said, could Volchenkov have and should he have went above some of these other guys that we just named? Yes, but I tried to keep the players at the same positions.
Right. And I think that makes sense. Like, he's your consolation prize. You didn't get Nick Cronwall, so you'll take Anton Volchenkov. Like, not as good of a player, not as physical, but a solid defensive defenseman. So he's kind of like, you didn't get Cronwall, but here's an okay defensive defenseman.
And the final pick is Curtis Foster.
I have no idea who that is.
Going to the St. Louis Blues. And Curtis Foster is just another. He's a solid defenseman. 400 games, 160 points, 300 PIM. Didn't really do anything crazy.
Yeah, so I think like my overall impression of this draft is that there's a lot of role players, a lot of second or third liners or second or third pairing defensemen, with a pretty solid, honestly, like a really good top like 7, I would say, and then it turns into like a bunch of role players. So, I mean, you're getting a lot of guys that had long careers. So, I would say that not great, but it's an okay draft, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the draft had a lot of defensemen going who weren't great. It had a lot of forwards who just were okay. Like even the best forwards here, Justin Williams, Scott Hartnell, minus the top 2, like they weren't even Dominic Moore. Like they were, like you said, role players. They were second liners, third liners, maybe a power play guy. No one out here was skating around the rink scoring goals or getting points every game.
Yeah.
Most of these guys don't even have a point per game, and they're not even close to it.
I think I agree for the most part with your redraft as well. I personally probably would have put Torres down a little bit. I would have moved Volchenkov up a little bit. Maybe Englund over... Or not England, maybe Volchenkov over Greg Zanin. But I mean, for the most part, everybody's really kind of where they should be, especially that top 5. I think you really can't go wrong with anybody in that top 5. I mean, Henrik Lundqvist, Marian Gaborik, Danny Heatley, Scott Hartnell, or Nick Cronwall. You're really not going to get much of an argument out of anybody for any of those players. So I think overall, I more or less agree, and I think that this was a draft for you to really pick up some third, fourth line type guys.
Exactly. It was a draft to maybe try and help rebuild on, but not get your superstar.
So, do you have any last things to say, or do you want to move on?
No, that's pretty much it. We covered it all, I would say.
All right. So, I did the 2012 NHL Entry Draft. So, we'll go down a list of the real first picks, and then we'll go down my redraft. So, obviously, number 1, Edmonton Oilers, Nail Yakupov. I don't think he would go in the top 30 this time around. Ryan Murray went number 2 to the Blue Jackets. Alex Galchenyuk went 3. Griffin Reinhart, again, not going in the first round. The guy has played, like, I don't even know if he's set foot on NHL ice at this point. I think he's played all of his career in the minors. He might have played a couple of injury games at some point, but, like, no. This is a really good draft, by the way, for defensemen, as you're going to see. You got Hampus Lindholm, then Dumba, Derek Pouliot, Jacob Trouba, Slater Cuckoo, who I dropped him out of the top 30, spoiler alert. I think he probably would drop out because he's still stuck in the minors and hasn't played that much. Philip Forsberg, Grigorenko, Faxa. Grigorenko, you'd probably, again, drop out. I think he's playing in Europe now. I don't even think he's on an NHL roster. Or he might be on the Avalanche roster. Gergensen's the fourth liner for the Blue Jackets, so he'd probably also drop out. Cody Ceci, Tom Wilson. I'm surprised went as low as he did. Thomas Hertl, Teravainen, Vasilevsky, Scott Lawton. I mean, probably would drop out of the top 30. Mark Jankowski would probably drop out. Ole Matters in this draft. Mike Matheson, he'd probably drop out. I'm going to get to Malcolm Subban. He's a very interesting one, and I'll talk about him. Jordan Schmaltz, he would probably drop out. Brendan Gaunce, Henrik Samuelsson, those two, again, probably wouldn't be in the top 30. Brady Shea, Stephane Matteau, and Tanner Pearson. Those are the actual draft picks in this draft. So real life, the teams did a pretty okay job, but I think we can improve on that a little bit. So we'll start. The first overall pick, this was actually a tough decision for me. So instead of drafting Nail Yakupov, I had the Edmonton Oilers drafting Morgan Rielly, first overall. This was really tough because I really think Andrei Vasilevsky should probably be a top pick. My thought process when I went into this was I took a look at, obviously, the players as we know them now, and then I took a look at the rosters at the time to see what the need was. So the Oilers at this point had 24-year-old Devin Dubnyk, who, if you remember, like, they gave him such a long leash in Edmonton that it really wasn't until he was like 28, 29, 30 that he went to the Minnesota Wild. So I don't think they would really necessarily draft a goaltender, but they really badly needed defensemen, so I ended up going with Morgan Rielly as your new number one overall pick.
I don't even think that's a bad pick.
I think Morgan Rielly is probably a number one overall pick just because, like, dynamic offensive defenseman. Up until the last month of last season, he was supposed to be a Norris candidate. I mean, he's, you know...
The only thing that I would say is that I think the Edmonton Oilers could have taken Philip Forsberg. I think he fits their style of play personally. And
yeah,
I think he could have.
Sure.
I think he would have done really well with Halsey and the Nuge at the time.
Yeah, so I mean that was really the thing, right? So like they drafted Nail Yakupov to play on that first line as a winger, so
and he just couldn't.
It would make a lot of sense for Philip Forsberg to end up taking that spot. The thing is, I looked at the roster and they had a lot of really young forwards at the time that could have still developed into that top liner, whereas their defense core was kind of older, over the hill. I went back and forth between giving them Jacob Slavin, who, spoiler alert, goes number 2 to the Columbus Blue Jackets instead of Ryan Murray. But I feel like, given the Edmonton Oilers' play style, they clearly seem to want to be go, 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 all offense all the time. And even today, they don't really invest in their goaltenders that much, so I think they would probably want an offensive puck-moving defenseman like Morgan Rielly. And for Columbus with Jacob Slavin, I mean, they took Ryan Murray. I mean, Jacob Slavin's just the next best defenseman on this list, in my opinion. I mean, he's one of the best defensive defensemen in the National Hockey League today. And he's a very Blue Jackets type player where he just kind of does his job, you know? And, like, he doesn't really... not very flashy. So that's why I ended up going with Jacob Slavin. Although you could argue that maybe they should have taken a goaltender as well, but at the time they still had was it Steve Mason? They had a goalie at the time. It might have been Steve Mason, or he might have left, but they had a goalie, so I think I went with a defenseman on that. And by the way, Tim, you know, if you have anything to interject at any point, just
I know. I will. I just I'm kind of taking in what you have to say. I don't really disagree with anything you had to say. I also think that Columbus Blue Jackets team having just lost. And actually, they still had the whole little Rangers core they had going. So they really didn't need a forward. They could have used a. Teravainen might have been a good fit on that team, honestly.
Yeah, I thought about Toivo as well, and he is going to the Montreal Canadiens in my redraft third overall. The reason that I
think it's interesting that you did that actually though, that you put him going to the Canadiens.
Yeah, so my reasoning for kind of the number 2 and 3 pick was, I just think Jacob Slavin is probably the most underrated defenseman in the NHL at this point. And I think if you could compare what he does on the ice versus the output that you're getting from Toivo Teravainen, who's had some good years for Carolina, but it's really only been the last season or two that he's really stepped out of his shell. Before then, he was kind of just a second, third-ish liner. So that's why he goes to Montreal, because they need scoring bad, like really bad. And I did want to give them Philip Forsberg because Forsberg had that scoring touch, but I think Teravainen, especially recently, has shown more of a propensity to find the back of the net than Philip Forsberg has.
See, though, I think it's interesting because this was Subban's team at the time. So I think it's interesting that. So do you prepare for this in prep? Do you do that in preparation for? Like, would you consider drafting a defenseman in preparation for them eventually getting Shea Weber, who, in my opinion, was a downgrade?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the thing is, at the time, Subban was still really young, and they still had an aging. They still had some other pieces who were aging but still effective, like Andrei Markov.
Up to that point, though, he had 38 points, 36 points, 38 points, Subban.
Yeah, so the thing is, it's tough to say because I think the thing that really led me to Teravainen instead of a defenseman was watching those Montreal Canadiens teams in the playoffs specifically, year after year, destroy my bracket because they couldn't score a goal.
Yeah, who they had? They had Gallagher. They had
Brian Giunta.
That little shit.
What's his
guy's
face?
Like 5'2".
Stupid turtleneck guy. Oh my god, I can see his stupid face with his wearing his turtleneck. I don't remember his name. But then they also had at some point. They just the issue is they never had an explosive offensive player, and that killed them every year. They just need somebody like Teravainen who's crafty with the puck, who can weave in and out of the offensive zone and just find the back of the net. Yeah, I don't know what Pacioretty's issue was with that team. I mean, he's developed into more of a power forward now, but yeah, I think specifically, would they like to have a Jacob Slavin instead of a Shea Weber? Absolutely. But given those early or those mid to late 2010s...
Well, I'm saying, do you think that they trade? Do you think that they go for Weber if they...
No. If they have Jacob Slavin, there's no reason to go for Shea Weber.
You think that they keep Subban then?
I think so, because I think he's a perfect complement. Because Jacob Slavin is super reliable. He's not very flashy, and he's not going to get you a ton of points, but he's the perfect complement to a guy like Subban, who can be pretty high risk sometimes with the passes and the plays that he makes. So it's
almost like Dan Girardi playing with McDonough back on the Rangers.
Right, he's the rock that lets this guy do whatever he wants. It's like when they played. It's like I'm trying to think of it. It's like if you play a guy like Erik Karlsson, really should have been playing with a guy like Vlasic instead of a guy like Brent Burns, right? You play him with a guy like Vlasic because Vlasic's just going to do his job in the defensive zone, so Karlsson can go out and do what he wants, So yeah, I mean, there's a really strong argument for taking a defenseman. The next available defenseman on my list would have been Jacob Trouba. I just think that the thing that killed the Canadiens for years was their inability to have any excitingly offensive players, and they really relied on just funneling it to the net, and it just didn't work, So That's my reasoning for putting Teravainen in there. Fourth overall pick, New York Islanders draft Andrei Vasilevsky. I think this was pretty much a no-brainer. Sure, we had 22-year-old Kevin Poulin and 23-year-old Anders Nilsson at the time, but being an Islanders fan, I can tell you from experience that the org and the team really wasn't that high on either one of them. There really was no backing for either one of them to even start a full season and try to be the starter. I think Kevin Poulin, had everything gone right for him, could have been a solid backup. Anders Nilsson has always just been a backup. So even at the time, we really knew those two guys weren't going to work out. So I think it was pretty much a no-brainer to draft a Vezina candidate goaltender and Andrei Vasilevsky.
Yeah, I agree. No arguments over here.
Toronto takes Philip Forsberg. This was really interesting because they had 20. I think James Reimer at this point was 24, and this was kind of around a time when he was starting to break out of his shell until they traded for Bernier and ruined James Reimer's career. But this was when Reimer was really starting to step into his own in Toronto, so they didn't really need the goaltender. Obviously, in real life, they took Morgan Rielly, so I could have given him Jacob Trouba, but I think when I looked at that roster, there was really just that lack of creativity, because this is like pre-Mitch Marner, pre-Austin Matthews, pre-William Nylander, Toronto Maple Leafs, where that offensive front, there wasn't a lot of creativity there. It was very north-south type hockey. And that's why I ended up going with Philip Forsberg instead of a defenseman or a goaltender. Now, given this... Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. I just I think that's a really interesting one. You don't even want to consider some of those goaltenders up for grabs?
It's tough, right? Because obviously, is a guy like James Reimer going to end up turning out to be a Connor Hellebuck or a Frederick Anderson or, hell, even a Eunice Korpisalo? Obviously, we know the answer now is no.
You also don't think that, given the issues that they have currently with stopping the other team from scoring, that they couldn't use someone like Trouba, who's a great defensive defenseman?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing, an interesting point to make, right? Like, do they need another scoring winger? Obviously, right now, the answer would be no. At the time, they could have used it. They could have used that extra creativity. Knowing what we know now, I mean, obviously now they have Frederick Anderson, but it was a weird time for the Maple Leafs because, like I said, Reimer was kind of back and forth between is he the guy, is he not the guy, and between 24 to 26, he really started to step in and own, his reputation and really be the guy. I mean, he had his best career year the year before they traded for Jonathan Bernier. I mean, he really looked like he could have been never going to be an elite guy, but maybe he could have been above average until they traded for Jonathan Bernier and threw his career down the toilet. I think given everything that goes on, I might be tempted to take Jacob Trouba there, and I really think if you told me that you take Jacob Trouba there, I would agree with you. I just think that Philip Forsberg fits what it meant to be a Toronto Maple Leaf going forward. I mean, even to this day, we can see that the Toronto Maple Leafs do not invest in the defensive zone. I mean, clearly, the only two players on that team that I think you could even argue play in the defensive zone are Jake Muzzin and... the guy they just traded for from the LA Kings, Kyle Clifford. So I think, the mentality of the ownership at the Toronto Maple Leafs has never been to invest in a defensive zone, but could they use it? Yeah, for sure. So if you tell me I'm taking Jacob Trouba there or even Matt Dumba instead of Philip Forsberg, I'm probably not going to argue that,
Well, to be honest, I would take Slavin there, but that's because I would have reordered my draft personally. Like I said, I would have had Forsberg going first to that Oilers team. But I just think that the Maple Leafs could have used a defense. But I think that's about that.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't really think that I personally or anyone else is really going to argue that too hard. Obviously, they need a lot of help keeping the puck out of the net. So, yeah, bit of a controversial pick. number 6 was Connor Hellebuyck going to the Anaheim Ducks. Again, this was kind of before they found John Gibson, and this was before they had Freddie Anderson, because obviously Freddie Anderson's the next pick. It's really interesting to me that there's so many good goaltenders in this draft, and none of them really went in the first round besides Vasilevsky. But yeah, I think Connor Hellebuyck, if you put him on a team that has a defense, even on a team without a defense right now in the Winnipeg Jets, he's a Vezina caliber goaltender. I love the way he plays, and the Ducks at the time needed a goaltender. They really didn't have anybody. This was kind of towards the end of some eras where, clearly later on in the draft they ended up taking Freddie Anderson. So clearly they were looking for a goalie, and I think that Hellebuyck fits the mold. And then kind of in the same vein here, the Minnesota Wild take Frederik Andersen because this was before they ended up finding gold in Devin Dubnyk for the couple of really good years he had for them. The Wild have never really had a goalie outside of a few good years from Nick Backstrom. So I think it's what makes Nicholas Backstrom, the goaltender.
Oh, okay.
He was kind of okay for them. And then Josh Harding, obviously, unfortunately, had the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which prematurely ended his career. Otherwise, he probably would have been a great goalie for them. But I think given the way the team is now and given where they are, I think they needed a goaltender at the time, and Anderson fits that mold.
I couldn't agree more.
It's really between him and Hellebuyck. I mean, it's just two great options there.
As to them, I don't see they needed a goalie. Whoever you want to give them is kind of irrelevant because all the goalies left are just great, or the 2 goalies that you would have to choose from were great.
Next up was the Pittsburgh Penguins, who originally took a defenseman. They took Derek Pouliot. If they need a defenseman, let's just give him a better one and take Jacob Trouba at this pick. I love Jacob Trouba. I'm really personally very disappointed that the Islanders didn't take him in this draft, and I'm disappointed that when his name came up on the market, we didn't take a jump at him. I've always been a huge Jacob Trouba fan. I love the way he plays. He's a solid 2-way defenseman who can chip in on the offensive zone. And if the Penguins at the time needed a defenseman, which clearly they did, why not just take a better one? And he fits the Pittsburgh Penguin mold. I mean, he can play both ends of the ice. He can skate with a guy like Sidney Crosby, or he can go back and defend when a guy like Crosby, or playing with more high-flying talent. If at the time maybe Phil Kessel was out on the ice or something like that, you have a guy like Jacob Trouba to kind of clean up his mistakes. So took Jacob Trouba there, and I think that's a great fit. Winnipeg ends up taking Tom Wilson. This was interesting because I think Tom Wilson is a perfect Winnipeg Jet. If you look at, he's basically Blake Wheeler 2.0. I mean, big body, fast skater, can hit hard, puts the puck in the back of the net. I mean, if you put him on the second line, that really gives that top 6 a lot of balance. It gives it the size and speed. And this was a very young Winnipeg Jets team at the time. I mean, this team had just recently transferred over from the Atlanta Thrashers. So get a big body in there, get a guy who's going to stir up some controversy, get a guy who's going to throw some hits, make himself loved by the fans. I think he's a perfect pick for a young Winnipeg Jets team.
I thoroughly agree. I love Tom Wilson. I think he's one of the premier 2-ways of the league.
I hate his guts, but I have to admit he's a great power forward.
I think he really gets in there. He grinds his ass off. No homo. And then he winds up with it, or he makes enough of a play that someone else winds up with it. He's really good at forcing the play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is what every team needs.
And, for a Winnipeg Jets team that was coming off of what the Atlanta Thrashers were trying to build, which was more of a power forward heavy type team, I mean, he fits that mold. Tampa Bay Lightning, this was an interesting one. They take Slater Cuckoo. Obviously, later on in this draft, they were going to take Andrei Vasilevsky. And at the time, again, the Lightning kind of needed a goaltender. They really didn't have anybody that was, really locking down or lighting the league on fire. I forget. I think. Let's see. Who was their goaltender? Because it was really funny to me when I looked it up. But I think Matt Murray. I know a lot of people are gonna kind of have issue with taking Vasilevsky, Hellebuck, Freddie Anderson over Matt Murray. I mean, he's a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, right? But
He was on the Pittsburgh Penguins.
yeah, especially now where his job is being threatened by 2 other goaltenders in Tristan Jarry and Casey DeSmith. I mean, they had Matthew Garon, Dwayne Rollison, Dustin Tokarski, and Sebastian Caron. So they desperately needed a goaltender. He has 2 Stanley Cups. I'm gonna give him that, and I'm not taking that away from him.
He was clutch when it mattered. That doesn't mean that he was a great goalie.
It's really hard to judge because was he great because he was on the Penguins, or were the Penguins good because of him? Obviously, he played well for them in those 2 Stanley Cups. I'm not taking that away from him.
Let's also not forget that he took Fleury's job from him in the middle of the playoffs.
Right. And clearly he's a great goaltender. I would consider him, in my opinion, above average, almost on the cusp of elite. But he's had a couple of consistency problems. His job is being threatened at one point this season by Tristan Jarry. And he just seems to have those nights where you really question, like, is he really still the guy? And I think Anderson, Hellebuck, and Vasilevsky have just been more consistent. Sure, they haven't reached that high yet of winning 2 Stanley Cups, but they also didn't play for a powerhouse Pittsburgh Penguins team. So that's my reasoning for putting him lower than those 2. And obviously the Lightning needed a goalie real bad. Washington Capitals are 11th. They end up taking Matt Dumba. I was very interested in the real life when they took Philip Forsberg. I really wasn't so sure why they were taking a scoring forward. I mean, clearly, even at the time, we all knew they didn't need more scoring. Their issue was always a goaltender / keeping the puck out of the back of the net. I think Matt Dumba's a perfect Washington Capital just because they don't really have that big, bruising, heavy, big-body defenseman. And he just kind of fits that mold. He fits a niche that they don't have. He can kill penalties. He's tough to play against, and I don't even necessarily think he's better than the next pick, which the next pick is Esa Lindell to the Buffalo Sabres. I don't even necessarily think he's a better defenseman. I actually think Esa Lindell is a better defenseman than Matt Dumba in terms of his overall game. Esa Lindell brings a little bit more offense to his game, but Matt Dumba, being the type of defenseman that he is, that big, hard, heavy-hitting defenseman, works out for the Capitals. And Esa Lindell works out for the Sabres because the Sabres needed scoring. They needed some sort of flair to the back end, which they didn't have. They needed somebody exciting back there to bring something, and I think that Esa Lindell brings that type of play to the back end of the Buffalo Sabres at the time. Next was Tomas Hertl to the Dallas Stars instead of Radek Faksa. I like Radek Faksa. I think he's a solid center, but if you can take Tomas Hertl, who brings a little bit more offense to his game while being just as good defensively, brings a little bit more flair, a little more pizzazz. I think
Flash.
Yeah, a little bit more ability to end Martin Biron's career. I think you'll take Tomas Hertl there. I'm getting an update for NVIDIA. Thank you. The Buffalo Sabres again had another pick, and then they drafted Andreas Athanasiou. I wanted to give them the forward because they clearly took Grigorenko and Girgensons with the idea that they needed a forward. I gave them Athanasiou because he's, lights out speed, that ability to score, which is clearly what they were aiming for in Mikhail Grigorenko. He was drafted to be a scorer. Sure, Athanasiou is only a winger. He's not a center. But the next available center that I think was there is Alex Kerfoot, and he doesn't bring as much scoring or speed. I liked Athanasiou's fit on the Buffalo Sabres a little bit better, and I had to give them that forward because they clearly were looking for it in this draft. And if you have 2 picks, you might as well take a forward and a defenseman to see what you can get. Up next was the Ottawa Senators, who drafted Colton Parayko. It was really interesting for me to try to rank a lot of these defensemen because obviously we know Shane Gostisbehere came into the league and he had a really good rookie season. He's the next pick. Shane Gostisbehere goes to the Washington Capitals.
I think the issue with rating them is that the defensive defensemen are. It's hard to tell how good they truly are until it's like later in their career and you can look back at it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I totally agree. Where the offensive defensemen tend to get the big front news, pages,
Feinberg.
right? They tend to be more flashy. They tend to get drafted higher. It was hard. I mean, I almost wanted to put Hampus Lindholm and Olli Maatta over Shane Gostisbehere because Gostisbehere's had some consistency problems recently. His name's been kind of on the trade block here and there. They've talked about maybe moving on from him. But I like Colton Parayko a lot. The Senators needed a defenseman. That's why they drafted Cody Ceci, so I just gave them Colton Parayko is a little bit better. The Capitals, again, Capitals having multiple picks in this draft. They drafted Matt Dumba at 11th in my redraft, so I figured let's give him a forward. Or not another forward. Let's give him another defenseman here. So they take two defensemen here, which is really what they needed at the time. I think even back then, those Capitals teams always had enough scoring. It was just an inability to keep the puck out of the net that always kind of killed them. And, Gostisbehere brings a little bit more of an offensive flair. We could anchor that power play 1 for them. Or power play 2. Obviously, John Carlson would anchor the power play 1, but that's why I went with Gostisbehere there. Up next was San Jose. I gave him Tanner Pearson. They drafted Tomas Hertl in real life, but I think Tanner Pearson's a prototypical San Jose Shark, just a two-way, 200-foot player, can put the puck in the back of the net if you need him to. I think he's severely...
West Coast hockey, baby.
Yeah, I think he's underrated. I think he's doing great things for the Vancouver Canucks, and a lot of people their eyes are getting opened on him. Could I have put Alex Kerfoot there to match the center? Yes, but when you think about the centers that the San Jose Sharks had at the time, I mean, Joe Thornton and Joe Pavelski, you're not gonna get
Pavelski's numbers. His face-off percentage is, I think it's over 50. Yeah. I think he was like 51, 52.
It's
like how do you
crazy.
beat that?
Right, and you have to remember, when you're drafting Kerfoot in this draft, he was drafted to be a scorer. Now we know he didn't turn into that. So would an Alex Kerfoot work on the third line of a San Jose Sharks team? I think so, but I just think Tanner Pearson's really underrated, and he plays West Coast hockey so well. Not to mention the Sharks would be taking him away from the LA Kings, which just only helps them. Next up was the Blackhawks, who took Alex Kerfoot. In real life, at this point, they take Teuvo Teravainen. There's not a lot of scorers really left in this draft. I mean, you've got Galchenyuk down there who hit 30 goals once, but since then his career really hasn't taken off. Kerfoot is just a good third-line center, and for a team that was as stacked as the Blackhawks were at the time, I mean, that offensive core was just rigged from top to bottom with goal scorers. You can take a center like Alex Kerfoot, who's going to play that 200-foot game and kind of be that penalty kill anchor type player. They didn't need a defenseman. They still had Keith, Seabrook, and Leddy, so they don't need a defenseman at this point.
And Seabrook was in dog shit.
Yeah, his career hadn't tanked yet, so that was that. So they didn't want to take a defenseman. They obviously didn't need a goalie. Up next, we had Tampa Bay takes Olli Maatta. So obviously Tampa Bay earlier in the draft, I gave them Matt Murray to replace Vasilevsky. They clearly drafted Slater Cuckoo for a reason. They needed a defenseman at the time. We'll give him Olli Maatta, again, another kind of defensive type defenseman who's had a decent career. He's not going to put up the offensive numbers that Hampus Lindholm will, or even a guy like Brady Shea will, but again, for a team that's rigged, even at this point, we knew this team was stacked from top to bottom with goal scorers. They needed help keeping the puck out of the net, so they needed that goalie. They needed that defensive-type defenseman. So I gave them Olli Maatta instead of a guy maybe like Brady Shea or Hampus Lindholm. And then Lindholm,
I'm very surprised.
Yeah, I think Lindholm is a great player.
The guy's playing like 23 minutes a night.
Hampus Lindholm is a fantastic player, and I think he's severely underrated, for sure. I think he doesn't get enough love on the West Coast. Part of that is also because the Ducks team is falling apart a little bit.
I was going to say, the Ducks are just tanking. Like, no one's interested in them.
I think he's severely underrated. I 100% agree. I was tempted, like I said, to put him even over Shane Gostisbehere, but I think
Lindholm was in my Sweden draft.
yeah.
He was on my team.
I think looking at the team the Lightning had at the time, Stamkos, I think St. Louis was still on their team at the time. He hadn't come over to New York. Eventually they would end up with guys like Nikita Kucherov, Braden Point. Knowing where the team was going and knowing where they were at the time, I think it was really the defense and goaltender that killed them. So that's why I went with a more defensive type defenseman in Olli Maatta instead of Hampus Lindholm. But I think, again, it's kind of the Matt Dumba, Esa Lindell situation. I think Lindholm is the overall better defenseman. I just think the player that Olli Maatta fits the Lightning at the time better. You know what I'm saying?
I understand. Next up is Hampus Lindholm.
Yeah, so that's
I don't really have anything to say.
That's kind of those two covered. Hampus Lindholm, severely underrated defenseman in my opinion. Calgary Flames take Joonas Korpisalo. Obviously, Korpisalo was having a phenomenal season this year before he got hurt. It's really kind of hard to judge Korpisalo because he's always playing in the shadow of Sergei Bobrovsky before he left, and he's really only had this one season to start, but he's proven that he's a solid backup, reliable backup, and he's proven this season, at least before he got hurt, that he could start and win you a lot of games. So that's why I went with Joonas Korpisalo. The Flames at the time didn't really have a goaltender. They still really don't. I mean, they have David Riddick, yes, but he's been super inconsistent, so we'll see.
Smith? Come on.
Long-term goaltender, I'll say. They haven't had
I'm also joking about that.
I mean, he was good for them when he was there, for sure.
Yeah, until he got knocked out.
But I think they could use a more consistent goaltender like Joonas Korpisalo has turned into. Next up, Cody Ceci goes to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Again, at this point in the draft, the Penguins are taking Olli Maatta in real life. I think Cody Ceci is just a nice consolation prize for considering the defensemen that are left at this point.
Yeah.
And at this point in the draft, I started to look less at what the teams needed and just who's the best available player. Which I think, in real life, when you get down into the 20 to 30 range, teams is just like, okay, who's the best available player on the board? Unless you're looking for a goaltender, you're really just taking the best player.
Yeah, it's pretty fair.
Which is why Radek Fax ends up going to the Panthers. I like him better than Cedric Paquette. I think Radek Fax is a great two-way player. This next one was interesting because I picked Adam Pelech 24th overall to the Boston Bruins, and I know a lot of people are going to call me a hometowner for that, but having gotten to watch the type of player that Adam Pelech is, I mean, you can see it when he got hurt. The Islanders' defense went completely off the rails. I mean, they were not the same team. He's clearly a vital cog in that defensive core. He's playing top 2 minutes, and he's a prototypical Boston Bruin. He's big, mean, he's nasty. He'll slash you, he'll punch you, he'll get in your face, he'll drop the gloves. He's a Boston Bruin type player. And again, the Bruins, maybe they don't need defense necessarily, but he's such a Boston Bruin.
I was actually just going to say, do they really need defense, though?
No, they don't. But at this point in 2012, the Bruins didn't really need anything. I
think it's still relevant even today.
Yeah, do the Bruins need anything at this point? No. So it's kind of hard to draft for them knowing that the team is still going to be as competitive as they are. This was the team that was coming off a Stanley Cup win. So it's who do you even... Or not a Stanley Cup win. A year removed from a Stanley Cup. So it's who do you draft,
Yeah, who are you cutting for this kid?
Yeah, I think Adam Pelech is he's a solid defenseman that can play. Clearly, he can play top 2. He's been doing it for the Islanders. He could play bottom 6 if you need him to. Put him out there for bottom 6 minutes, but give him top 2 on a penalty kill. And again, knowing the type of defenseman he is, I think the Bruins fans would love him. He's rough and tumble, mean, nasty, plays with an edge, Boston Bruin type hockey. St. Louis Blues take Galchenyuk. I dropped Galchenyuk way down in this draft. He had one good year for the Canadiens where he hit 30. Hasn't really done it in Phoenix. Is that his fault? Probably not. Phoenix Coyotes don't really have, for the longest time, didn't have a great team. And even this year when I thought they were going to be good, they're still struggling. They're kind of on that playoff bubble. It's hard to tell. Is it Galley's fault? Is it not? But, I mean, even in Montreal, he wasn't playing with goal scorers, so is it fair to judge him? I don't know, but he's not really a two-way forward either, so he doesn't really bring some of the things that, like, Radek Faksa or Alex Kerfoot bring. So that's why he dropped down this far, in my opinion. The next two, Ryan Murray and Brady Shea, I think are kind of interchangeable. I think Brady Shea might get taken over Ryan Murray because Ryan Murray's playing like bottom 6 minutes for the Columbus Blue Jackets. He didn't turn out to be the scorer they thought he was going to be. But I think you can interchange those two. They're more or less kind of the same player, offensively minded, younger, smaller type defenseman. Not really getting. You can't really argue either one of the other. They're kind of similar. I think Shea has more upside, but that's remains to be seen.
Can I ask, where's Severson?
Why Severson, or where is he?
Where is he?
He's number 30.
You don't think he goes before Brady Shea?
No.
That little shithead?
No. And I'll tell you why. So the next two picks, Cedric Paquette and Brock McGinn, big body, tough kind of guys. I just really like both of them. They're reliable. You're not getting a lot of pizzazz, but you know what you're getting out of them. And then Damon Severson. So the thing is with Damon Severson is, like, he's such a, like, and you can make the same argument about Shea. He's like such a liability in the defensive zone. I think Shea has a lot more upside to his game than what we saw over the last 2 years in New York. I think a lot of it came down to that big contract and a lot of expectations after his rookie season. And, you know, let's be fair, for argument's sake. Rangers fans can tend to pick a guy.
Shit on Brady Shea.
They'll pick a guy and then, like, he's the whipping boy, right? So, like, towards the end of his tenure there, like, Brad Richards was it. Like, he was never good enough. He's not doing anything. And to be fair, like, he kind of wasn't, right? But, like,
then the playoffs rolled around. That's the issue.
Right? And then it was, like, then after that, it was, like, who's not doing enough? Well, Rick Nash is now the guy, like, that we're going to pinpoint, right? It's just tough. And I think a lot of the pressure got to Brady Shea of trying to live up to that rookie season. I still think he has a lot of upside. He's shown that he can do it, and I think a smaller market's going to help him. And Damon Severson has never had the peak that Shea hit. So I don't know that Severson could ever be as good as Shea was his rookie season, is the thing. You know? Like, Shea had that big high, and so he might be able to do it again, whereas Damon Severson's kind of just been okay his whole career.
So, I have a few other questions, but I guess we should finish.
Well, I mean, that's it. Like, Damon Severson's, like, the last pick, and it's like...
Oh, okay.
You know.
So, did you not think of Nikita Gusev? Did he not...
So, I actually have a list of, like, players that might have made it, and Gusev was on there. Some of the other interesting names that just... Like, I picked these guys out of the draft, but they didn't make it in the top 30. Malcolm Subban just missed. Derek Pouliot missed. And Nikita Gusev missed. The thing with Nikita Gusev is, like, this is his first year in the NHL. So I still don't even know, like, what is he, right? Because he was playing overseas for so long. I still don't understand why the Golden Knights traded him. But it's like...
Do you think that they know something we don't?
I mean, they might, right? Like, because he was touted as the best player not in the NHL, right? Like, that's all we heard about Nikita Gusev. He's the single best player not playing in the NHL, not counting, like, rookies or anybody in the minors, right? Like, he was the overseas draft pick that everybody wanted. And he's putting up decent numbers on the New Jersey Devils, who are not a good team. So there's something to be said for that, for sure. But I think if teams knew that they would have to wait 8 years to get him to set foot in an NHL jersey, and then you still don't really know what he is, like, would I rather have that instead of like a Brock McGinn, who I know for a fact is a fourth liner, but he's reliable? In my opinion, no. I think he would slip in the draft to. He would probably keep slipping down further and further, but a team would definitely take a flyer on him, just like, because what if he comes over earlier, you know? But I don't know that. Because, again, like, I don't really know who he is yet. You know, this could be a flash in the pan. I mean, who knows? It's hard to it's not hard to argue for him. It's just hard to say, you know, how good is he yet? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That was going to be my argument. Is that the other thing? Like, did he just not have enough games under his belt? And that's fair.
You said you had other questions, or was that it?
You, I'm not a big Jimmy VC guy, but like, did you consider him at all? Out of curiosity.
Knowing what he turned into, not really. I mean, obviously at the time he was like a really highly touted pick, but knowing that he's basically going to turn into more or less like a very undersized fourth liner, I mean, he's really not even good at that role. So it's tough because a guy of his size, like if he's not scoring, there's not a lot of room for him on the fourth line, because if he's trying to be a checker, he's going to get run over. If he's trying to be a penalty killer, he's going to get boxed out. I think if you gave teams at the time and said, here's Jimmy Vesey, like obviously a lot of teams, like all 30 teams in the NHL wanted him. But knowing what he turned into, I think I would hold off on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's just about it. I mean, you get a pretty in-depth analysis. I don't really have much to pick apart or anything like that.
The only guy that I was really considering putting back in the top 30 was Malcolm Subban, because he's a decent backup goaltender.
I understand, but I think that not many teams are exactly looking for a starting goaltender, and so it's hard to get a backup if you. Or a lot of teams are looking for starters. The issue.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, I already put 5 goalies in the first round, which is a very high number. Like, typically goalies go in the second, third, fourth, fifth round. So I was like, can I really justify putting a 6th goaltender in the first round for it just to be Malcolm Subban? Not really.
That's the thing. Like, we know who Malcolm Subban is at this point. Teams aren't looking for someone like him.
Right. I think the other 5 goaltenders should definitely have been first rounders if we knew what they were going to turn into. Like a Vezina candidate in Vezina winner in Vasilevsky, a candidate in Hellebuck, a workhorse in Anderson, a 2-time Stanley Cup champion in Matt Murray, and the next big thing in Joonas Korpisalo. But it's like Malcolm Subban's kind of just So, So yeah, I mean, that's kind of my redraft. I think this draft was great for defensemen. There's a lot of really good defensemen. Obviously, you know, some pretty solid goaltenders.
I agree.
Obviously, these 2 drafts that we went over were pretty painful for me specifically, because it's like the Islanders drafted Rick DiPietro and Raffi Torres around all those other guys, which obviously Rick was hurt a lot. And then in this draft, we took Griffin Reinhart instead of like, I don't know, like Morgan Riley or like Hampus Lindholm or like Jacob Trouba, like of all the other defensemen in the draft. Do you remember? I'm very curious. Do you remember who you wanted the Rangers to take? Because I'm assuming maybe not, because they were a lower pick. Because I remember I wanted the Islanders to take Matt Dumba or Jacob Trouba. Like, those 2 were the picks that I wanted. Like, those were my guys. And they were both available, and we didn't take either one. I think, for the most part, like, everything kind of worked out, though. So, do you have any last-minute things, or are you good to wrap up?
I'm just about done.
All right. So, thank you guys for watching. The next episode we're gonna do is, who knows? I mean, maybe we should just do a really angry episode where we just like piss people off and say who's like the most overrated guy of all time, because his name probably rhymes with not Bevins, but I mean we can talk about that at another point in time. So I don't know what the next topic will be. We'll have to figure it out. Who knows at this point, right? But thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys next time.